You are listening to TMI for the week of June 25th, 2018.
This week on TMI, we speak to Louis Bertrand. Louis Bertrand is a taxpayer, concerned citizen, educator. He gives presentations at most of these public hearings. CNSC Commission is the regulator for nuclear. Their little trick these days is to create these very long licenses so they don't have to hold public hearings. Anyway, Louis Bertrand. There's hearings this week held by the federal nuclear regulator, and they're being held in Pickering, which is unusual. They usually hold these out as far away from the city as they can possibly justify. Where are they being held this week?
Okay, they're being held at the Pickering Recreation Center, so the city of Pickering. So this is about a block and a half from Pickering Town Hall, and a little bit more than a block and a half, maybe a couple of blocks from the Pickering GO station. So now this is reasonably accessible. The facility itself is wheelchair accessible, etc. This is a lot better. And for that, we have to thank a bunch of activists who raised a stink about it. And Pickering MP Jennifer O'Connell, who basically booked the facility for the CNSC and then posted publicly that she had done so, and kind of embarrassed them into taking the facility.
That's fabulous.
Kind of impressive.
So there's a GO station there. So you go to the Pickering GO station, and is there a bus that goes to, is it Valley Farm Road? Like, how do you cross the 401? Because I think the GO station is on the other side of the... What do you do?
So you get to the GO station, and there is actually a pedestrian overpass over the 401.
Okay.
That brings you right to the North Service Road and the Pickering Town Center shopping mall.
Yeah.
And if you just go east a couple of blocks, either through the mall or along the service road, and it's right there. It's pedestrian friendly, bicycle friendly, GO train friendly, pedestrian overpass, so you don't have to cross the 401. So it's also the site for Durham College and Centennial College. They have a joint satellite campus there. So it's is a lot more convenient than the original venue, which was a church on Bloor Street at Curtis Road, which is not accessible by transit, not accessible by bicycle, by car, unless you really want to travel a long distance from Regional Road 2.
And that's like 60 kilometers away from downtown Toronto.
Correct. Well, I'll take your word for it, but it's about right, yes.
Yeah. So they've located it in a more accessible location. I'm thinking there's Pickering 8 cinemas right there. You could catch a movie and catch some hearings. You could just get some shopping in. There's food, restaurants,
yep.
Shopping.
Yep.
It could be an outing.
Well, that's it. The program is interesting. If you just go to the CNSC website, and there is the PDF files for who's presenting on what day has been posted. I'm going Thursday. I can't remember if it's in the morning or the afternoon. I think it's early afternoon.
Yeah, we're going to put in our show notes a list of... There's, as you say, there's a website with the PDF that has the presenters, the list of
Correct.
Their written submissions, a URL to the webcast, and and then I think people need to realize that there's then some delay. If you miss the hearings, a couple weeks later you can watch the replay of them. They like to take a couple weeks to produce them, but they will be available in a couple weeks, the replay of the hearings, and so people can catch up on what they've missed.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's where the public hearings are being held. How will the public be received when they go to these hearings?
It's not hostile. It's
Right.
not, be aware that they're going to have some officers from Durham Regional Police Services at the door and around the facility just to maintain order. Obviously, there's a little bit of a baggage check as you go in. They'll just look inside your laptop bag or your purse and pat you down with a metal detector. It's a formality. Last time we had one of these hearings was at the Curtis. It was about the Darlington relicensing. And after a while, just going in and out, right, you start chatting with the police officers.
Mm-hmm.
They're not there to cause trouble. Some people get intimidated as soon as they see the uniform with the yellow stripe down the pants or the red stripes down the pants. They get kind of freaked out. It's just a formality. It is a public place. It's a rec center, so there's gyms, there's kids, there's activities going on all the time. So it's not hostile or anything like that.
But they're there to make sure that it's a safe, comfortable environment for people to just come in.
It's for show mostly.
Yeah, I found they put a lot of effort into being quite friendly, and I came and went quite a bit, so by the end of it, I think we were on a pretty personal... I think I was talking to them about nuclear policy, actually. So I used them as an audience a little bit, captive audience.
Yeah, well, yeah, but it's also don't make the mistake to assume that they're not interested. They're not supposed to express an opinion one way or the other while wearing the uniform, but they're people too, and they're residents of Durham Region.
Mm. What kind of people go to these hearings?
Number one is the people who have business there, so the various officials from OPG and the Nuclear Safety Commission staff and the commissioners themselves. But in the audience, you'll have, it's pretty polarized. You'll have people from the nuclear industry. If you have various industry associations, obviously the CANDU owners group, which is basically a group of the nuclear operators. There's the Canadian Nuclear Association, which is a lobby group for the industry. And then on the other side, you have people who have concerns about the way the industry is being run, the way the CNSC is regulating the operator, the way the operator is operating. And you also have another group, which is kind of interesting, is the people who benefit indirectly from the presence of OPG in the Durham region. So that's the soccer associations, the community groups, the Durham College, my employer. They get they got a $5 million grant over 5 years to renovate some of the technology labs. So these groups benefit from having as well as municipalities. Municipalities get some tax revenue as well as some community funding. So they're all in favor. So they'll be presenting there in support of the relicensing, but without giving any precise or technical arguments. They'll just say, "Hey, they're good business. They pay the taxes. We get some money. They've been wonderful. They've sponsored our whatever club." And
I found it interesting watching the Chalk River hearings. Presenters, I think 2 in a row, gave unbelievable testimony about waste being improperly stored and past practices that weren't even documented and leaks into local waterways. And then when it came to one of these proponents of nuclear, even the chairman of the commission was surprised that they had no concerns about local contamination when asked, "What do you think of the presentations just given by these opponents?" So, yeah, they don't want to talk about the bad news about nuclear.
No. And it's part of the industry strategy to get allies on side by being generous in the community, and any business does that.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunately the nuclear industry has a lot more. There's a lot more at stake than, let's say, a small light manufacturing company or.
Well, they're actually spreading around our electricity money. When they're bribing and giving host payments to local organizations and local municipal governments, they're using our electricity dollars to do that.
True enough. I wasn't gonna call it a bribe. I've taken, I'm just as a personal note here. In the past, I've taken a fairly aggressive stance during my oral presentations, and I've presented to, oh my goodness, some joint panels of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, CIA, and the CNSC, CNSC hearings themselves. And in the past, I've taken a sometimes fairly aggressive and combative stance in my presentation. This time, I'm trying to make it a little bit more neutral.
Right.
And the approach I'm taking is, you know what? Even if I was pro-nuclear, I would want to see it done right.
Yeah. And
this is the point that a lot of these pro-industry people are missing is, trust us, we know what we're doing, well, show me, right? So it's a matter of, you have a big responsibility to make sure these things do not spew radiation all over the countryside. Please take that responsibility seriously. Now, somebody who's listening to me right now just saying that will huff and puff and say, yes, we do take that responsibility seriously. And to which I reply, prove it.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I my mother, who was pretty liberal, she was also a federal public employee. And so when I was, 18, I had already been to actually, I think, the Darlington protest and was aware of the nuclear problems in Ontario, even at a sort of young age. And, she's a federal public servant, and she's basically looking at me saying, well, that's the way it is in Ontario. And I go on and on about the waste or the cost or the complexities of regulation, and she goes, but that's the policy in Ontario. So once we've taken a walk in a certain direction policy-wise, there's a lock-in effect. It's very hard to go backwards on it, and also I guess I'm a little disappointed that you'll be less adversarial. However, I know that they then use that as a license to limit the discussion. They'll just write you off as they'll categorize you as anti-nuclear, an opponent or whatever, and then not take some of your arguments seriously.
Well, no, that's it. Can I just come back just a moment?
Yeah.
When you're talking about policy? It's interesting. English is the one language that I know that makes a distinction between the word politics and policy. In French, it's politique. In German, it's politique for both. And that distinction kind of hides the fact that the outcome of politics is policy. And to say that, well, that's the policy and that's the way it is really a way of deflecting responsibility for political decisions, as you say, that have locked us in,
right.
And refusing to address those legacy. And unfortunately, with nuclear, you have these massive investments that in capital, in plant equipment, and so on, that have to run their course. Otherwise, the various investors would object. Right? It's one of those things. Once a massive investment like that is made, you want it to run its course, and there's really not much that we can do about it unless something catastrophic happens. But the point is that we should be questioning these items of policy. Unfortunately, the CNSC hearings are the only place where we can actually even discuss nuclear policy in Ontario. It barely got mentioned during the election. The Liberal government didn't mention it at all. They were just all for it. And there's no evidence that the new Doug Ford, progressive conservative, the PCs, would have any different opinion. And that's where the Ontario Energy Board, or just the legislature is absolutely silent on the issue. So CNSC is our only game.
Let me ask you this. It seems to me that there's a division of responsibility when it comes to policy, and it's split weirdly between the federal government with these CNSC hearings and then all the other questions like cost, alternatives, the ethics of it, what to do with the waste. I mean, all these other decisions get categorized as sort of political decisions that are actually seem to be grayed out, but seem to be the responsibility of the province. But there are no public hearings that deal with those issues of cost, alternatives, geopolitics.
Exactly the point. That's exactly the point.
And what they've done is they've taken the hardest area for the public to participate in, the science, which is and they made that the only forum for which the public can interface. I mean, that's yet another way of obfuscating the.
It's definitely limiting the debate. The one little ray of sunshine is that the CNSC does offer intervenor funding. So if you have a group, for instance, Northwatch and so on, can apply for a grant to contract out an expert on the subject matter to present either by remote link or write a report as a written submission, as well as make a presentation either in person or by conference call. And that is something that doesn't happen very often, for instance, in the provincial environmental assessment process. Even a full, what they call a full EA, there is no intervenor funding. There used to be, and then that got chopped as soon as people realized, or as soon as politicians realized that the public was taking advantage of it and using it to object to policy decisions or new construction. So that intervenor funding is welcome. And having said that, the CNSC process is totally flawed in that there's no cross-examination, there's no requirement, let's say, to have intervenors as well as staff and the licensee or license application to testify under oath. That was something that was remarked upon by a young lawyer who was participating in a CNSC hearing quite a while ago on behalf of the swim, drink, fish, the Lake Ontario waterkeepers.
That's fascinating.
And he wrote a little blog article, as far as I know, it's still up on the Lake Ontario waterkeeper site, saying, wait a second, there's no cross-examination, there's nobody swearing an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and so on.
Well, it's interesting. There's the idea of knowingly disseminating false information. So, and who would know better if the information they were disseminating but a room full of OPG scientists or CNSC staff? So if they lie in front of those mics, they are doing it knowingly.
Well, okay, again, the word lie, just like the word bribe, sort of brings up these big, ugly connotations. You know what? I'm convinced that they have convinced themselves that their propaganda, there's another loaded word, that their marketing slogans and talking points, they actually believe it. Yeah. So to use the word lie, I don't think lie means that you know that you're spreading false information. If you believe it, then you're just trying to pull people along to your point of view. There's a whole. I've talked to people who work for OPG, and they just launch into this patter saying, like, well, background radiation, blah, blah, blah. And that, like, there's no carbon, blah, 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 and so on. It's almost, those little toys where nowadays they're all electronic, but it used to be you just pull on the string and it would keep saying these things, like, Barbie and Teddy Ruxpin, if anybody remembers that.
Yeah.
It's very much like that. They've got the talking points on the tip of their tongue, and they just launch on cue.
It's almost sometimes listening to people of different religions. They resort to patterned rhetorical talking points, and they pass them off one at a time back and forth at each other, and it's tit for tat in that kind of conversation. As an educator, I was going to ask you this later, but as an educator, what can you tell me about talking to people who have opinions that you don't share?
Well, I teach in a technical subject, so I teach programming, embedded systems, as well as electronics at Durham College. And I very rarely have to debate with that kind of thing. The one thing that I do have, when I'm programming, is changing the attitude of students towards quality software. A lot of the software most of the software I deal with is not recognizable as an application. So my students aren't writing business applications, they're not writing websites, they're not writing the next Microsoft Word or anything like that. What they're doing is they're writing programs to make hardware go. So at the very least, it's respond to a button, turn on an LED. That's like exercise number one. Yeah. The other one is to make sure that the task responds within a limited time. So simulating something that has to respond, we're not doing anything scary like responding to a skid in a anti-lock brake system, but that's that's the nature of the programming I'm looking at, where the minute the wheel locks up, 5 milliseconds later, the pressure on the in the brake cylinder has been reduced by the action of the computer. We'll get to that whole embedded thing shortly, but a lot of students have this attitude that, it's good enough. I'll get 60, and move on. So there's where I have a friction point in trying to convince people, and I do that by presenting case studies of software-caused unintended acceleration. Use some pretty shocking phrases like, killer apps, software that kills, or death by algorithm. Have them do a little bit of research and presentation on these things, and try to instill a little bit of a quality culture in their programming assignments, even though there's no lives that hinge on the outcome of their weekly assignments. So coming back to your question, generally one-on-one works best, and asking questions,
right,
giving examples, and building up a personal relationship. I'm not saying we're going to go out for beers, but just being able to understand where they're coming from, and where I'm coming from. And that's, incidentally, one of the interesting things about teaching at a college level is that class sizes are a lot smaller than a university where you have a lecture hall with 200 or 300 people or more.
So asking questions and making the other person think rather than just telling them what to think is probably
people don't like being told.
Yeah.
And finding that middle ground, and the other one is to knock their thinking off the usual rails, right? So just not saying knock them about in any sort of violent way. Just say, hey, wait a second, what about this? And there's a danger to that. Cognitive science has taught us a lot about the art of debating and rhetoric and so on.
Right.
There was a well-known experiment. Well, I don't know if it's well-known, but it was discussed in a book on political psychology, is the experiment was to show, and this was done in the States, Republican, Democrat, that makes for a great psychological experiment because you only have two, and they would show a statement to a Democrat about their candidate that they agree with, and then immediately after a statement by the same candidate that disagrees, that contradicts the initial statement, right? So actually, they say this, but they did that. That's a contradiction. Same with the Republican. They said this, but then they did that, right? They said they were against taxes, but then they raised taxes. And they were using functional MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging, to see where in the brain there was activity.
Right.
And they noticed that when the Democrat or the Republican, didn't matter, was able to explain away the contradiction, saying, well, that was an exception, right? Any sort of rationalization, there was a little burst of activity in the frontal lobes, which is where the active thinking happens, and then a little hit at the pleasure centers. In other words, they congratulated themselves, chemically speaking, for having successfully rationalized out the cognitive dissonance.
Right.
So that is telling me that if you want to engage in that conversation, just make sure that there is that human relationship that would short circuit the strictly rational. I've managed to dismiss this cognitive dissonance. There's a whole bunch of very fascinating research that's been happening in the last 10 or actually 20 years or so about how we think, how we don't think, and how we communicate ideas and images.
Linking up mental processes with emotions is actually part of how I've heard you talk about how the sort of reward system of the brain works in terms of programming. If for a certain mental pattern there is a pleasure response, then you will continue on that track and be held in that pattern of behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. As the cognitive scientist George Lakoff, that's Lakoff if you want to look him up, says neurons that fire together wire together.
Right.
So the idea is to try to find imagery or thoughts or concepts that bypass, that go around those well-worn pathways.
I can't help at every turn, unfortunately, and this is not what I want to be talking about. We want to talk about Pickering, but equate everything to Trump supporters and Trump non-supporters, and I hear what you're saying, and I can see that. I could see that's how these divisions, this polarization is maintained, is that people are stuck on one track and the others are stuck on the other track, and they're all, as you say, reassured when they're convincing themselves that they're right. So, and it's the same thing. It's a kind of lock-in with a policy like nuclear. People who know people they like, who work for it, and maybe they trust them, they work for OPG or for the CNSC, they make these positive associations. Well, Frank's a nice guy. He wouldn't steer us wrong. But, Frank is reinforced by a lot of the talking points that he hears at the plant. And, I'm an extremist, so I say these people would kick grandma down the stairs to save their own jobs. But that's an extremist. Pickering. Let's get back to these hearings. What are the hearings about? I mean, they're extending the lifespan of Pickering past its designed for lifespan. Why are they doing that?
Oh, I think you'd have to ask them. The official reason that's been given is that we need the power generation capacity while the Darlington station, the 4 reactors are being refurbished. In other words, dismantled and rebuilt. So right now, Unit 2 of Darlington has been shut down for about a year and a half, or at least a year. There was just an announcement that they finished removing all the old stuff and are going to start the rebuild, and that should take, I suppose, about 2 years. I haven't looked at that in a while, so at least a year, if not 2. And then after that, the other 3 units in succession. So that's basically a 12-year effort, all told, to rebuild Darlington. So the assertion by OPG and by extension the Liberal government at the time was that we need that power to keep the lights on in Ontario. One of the that's basic. The not so the more skeptical view would say that, hey, it's good for business. There's about 3,000 people employed at Pickering. If we shut it down, all of a sudden we're going to have a little bit of an economic crash in Durham Region, and you'd have this everybody saying, "Hey, the government's a job killer," which is poison if you're in electoral politics. And the really cynical reason is that OPG has this thing on the Ontario government they've always had since the days of Ontario Hydro. The chairman of Ontario Hydro, or now OPG, can waltz into the premier's office and do an old-style gangster shakedown saying, "Hey, premier, you wouldn't want the lights to go out during your term now, would ya?" So, I mean, I can be cynical.
The other side of it is that some people are saying that we don't need the power generated by Pickering. We give away so much electricity, and of course we could be buying it from Quebec Hydro, from actual water hydro. We don't even need that plant. Isn't that one of the arguments?
That is the argument, and there is a report backing that by the OCAA, Ontario Clean Air Alliance. The argument is that most of that power is right now sold either at a ridiculously low price or even at a negative price. In other words, we're paying people in upstate New York and Ohio to take the power off our hands.
Wow.
Because in any in our electrical system, there is no storage capacity. So whatever gets produced at any moment has to be completely consumed at that moment. And if it means letting somebody else consume it, then that's what has to happen, electrically speaking. I mean, that's just the physics of it.
Have you suggested just now that then they bill us for taking our electricity?
That is correct.
Okay. I mean, that should be the front page of the news, shouldn't it? Be the front page of every...
I think we'd have to ask the IESO what's going on there. Now, obviously, that doesn't happen very often, but if in a situation, this is also why very often when you're driving around the countryside, you see the wind turbines still, and it's a nice sunny day and there's a nice wind, and you go, well, these wind turbines should be running. Well, no, they've been shut off because we can't use the power right now because the nuclear generators cannot be shut off on a dime. Well, they can be shut off. Obviously, if there's an emergency, they will shut off within a minute. But it takes 3 days to bring them back online, which was, if you remember the big blackout of 2003, the reason there was rolling blackouts for the next 2 or 3 days is because they were bringing up the nuclear reactors up to temperature so they could start generating.
It's very complex imagining how they keep the entire grid in phase and maintain voltages and balance capacity with production. It's actually mind-boggling to consider.
I quite agree. I'm an electrical engineer and I'm in awe of the work that's being done.
And these grids sometimes connect with other grids in other countries and states and provinces. I just can't, I never have been able to wrap my mind around how you maintain the phase, just the phase.
Well, that's actually phase maintained at the each generator. Each generator will match the phase that's being offered to it.
Yeah.
I have solar panels on my roof, and the inverter matches phase of whatever it sees on the power line that it's feeding. So that part of it is easy. It's managing the power flows themselves. If you look at the big blackout of 2003, what happened is that one line tripped, and the demand was being covered by another line, and there was basically too much power running through it. The wires heated up. Metal, when it heats up, expands, so the wires sagged and touched ground, touched the top of a tree underneath, and there was a short to ground, which also caused a trip, and then trip after trip after trip. It was, but managing the power flows is that's the trick, and metering, of course, and making sure the billing works. But yes, we do exchange power with New York State, Ohio, Quebec, and Manitoba, I believe, at the northwest Ontario to a small extent. There's there was a big coal-fired plant in Atikokan. Now I believe it's burning biomass.
Still burning stuff, though.
Yeah, basically waste wood.
Why are these plants, Pickering and Darlington, so close to the GTA? How did that come to happen?
That I don't know. I wasn't around for that history. First of all, Pickering and so Darlington. Just a little side trip here for Darlington. They were very clever when they came up with the Pickering plant. Everybody knew where Pickering was. It's a town on the outskirts, just past Scarborough. And then there was a bit of a stigma attached to Pickering. So when they built Darlington, well, where's Darlington? Well, it was named after Darlington Township, which is now part of the municipality of Clarington, or back then it was the town of Newcastle. So really, the name didn't give you an idea where the plant was.
Interesting.
Originally, they were out in the outskirts. So Pickering was a small town, mostly agricultural, 50 years ago, and the town of Newcastle was far away. Coincidentally enough, Darlington is very close to St. Mary's Cement. Well, it used to be St. Mary's Cement. Now it's, I think it's still St. Mary's Cement, but it's a different ownership.
You can see it on the highway, the giant cement plants.
And so nuclear plants need a lot of concrete. So if you could locate next to a concrete plant, then you've cut down your construction cost a lot. And concrete plants are very polluting. Therefore, well, one more polluter is nobody's going to care.
They have to heat the concrete to 5,000 degrees or something to get
the Portland. Yeah, it's Portland cement.
Is that a big user of electricity? Those plants?
No, but they're a big user of fossil fuels. St. Mary's will burn what they call petcoke, petroleum coke, which is basically the sludge that's left at the bottom after you've refined everything else. And that gets heated up to drive off all the volatile stuff, and all you're left with is basically pure carbon black. That's part of the problem. The Portland cement industry knows it has a problem because, chemically speaking, if you want to produce 1 ton of Portland cement, you have to release 0.8 of a ton, right? So 0.8 to 1 ratio of CO2, and that's just the chemistry of Portland cement, let alone the actual burning this very polluting petcoke or coal or some plants try to recycle to burn, let's say, old tires.
Yeah.
I think that was a case that was done.
I think somebody was suggesting you put PCBs in there and get rid of them.
As well, yes, just because of the high temperature,
Yeah.
PCB being very, very nasty
Yeah.
organic pollutants that stay in the environment for years.
And I'm sure none of that rises up the smokestack there, but that's just another issue.
Let's not go there.
Okay, so they locate these filthy nuclear plants next to the filthy concrete plants. Everybody's happy.
Yep.
But they haven't limited the population growth around Pickering. That's for damn sure.
No, the Durham Region, or the regional government for Durham, a few years ago revised their official plan, which they have to submit to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. And there were three options in the table that were presented by staff, and invariably they chose the maximum pavement option. In other words, maximum growth. And part of that is due to the fact that most municipal politicians have their election campaigns sponsored in large part by developers.
Mm-hmm.
So these house builders, they'll take a perfectly good pasture, get it rezoned as residential, and then build a bunch of houses, make a bunch of money. The municipality makes some money because the developers pay what's called a development charge. That way, the municipal politicians don't have to raise taxes. Right? If you raise taxes, you're going to be out of office. So they rely on these development charges to balance their budgets. The problem is the more development you have, the more cost you have. Fire engines, fire services, police services, sewers and water and so on. So you're always at a deficit that you have to cover by development charges, and it's a vicious cycle that just keeps on going. Which means that we have a lot of development around Pickering and now a lot of development around Darlington. The town of Curtis, and the town of Bowmanville have exploded in the last few years. And there's been no attempt to curb that development. In fact, it's highly encouraged by municipal politicians, who are the ones who come up to the hearings and say, OPG is a great employer and we love having them around here.
I never thought of what you said before. They should have called nuclear power plant Darlington Bowmanville Nuclear Power Plant.
Yes, the Bowmanville, or the Newcastle, as the name was at the time.
Without tipping your hand, what are some of the positions in your written presentation that you're going to be presenting this week at the hearings?
Well, my written presentation's already been submitted. There was a deadline of June 12 for the PowerPoint slides, and mid-May for the written submissions. So yes, OPG and CNSC already have my slides for today, or for this week. So I don't mind talking about it. My major point, and I'm going to base it on my understanding of how software works and how programs work in safety critical applications. And by no means am I an expert. In fact, I don't think there's anybody in the CNSC or OPG who has the expertise to deal with this kind of safety critical software now. There used to be, but I'm sure that those people are either retired or passed on. The main thrust is that you can't model software failure the same as hardware failure. Software is not like a pump that wears out, or a valve that gets stuck open or closed, or a seal that wears out over the years. So you can't statistically predict when software will fail. Software in itself it's the stuff of mind, right? It's something that's designed, that somebody designed and wrote. And assuming that they've written everything correctly is not sufficient. You have to make sure that the requirements were captured correctly. In other words, does the software the software as written, does it fulfill its mission? If you look at, think of it as a landmine. The software defect, in other words, it's an error, right? I hate the word bug, by the way. It's an error. It's a mistake. It's a defect. Somebody screwed up, right? And it's never a machine that's screwing up. If you assume that the machine is, if you separate hardware reliability from software reliability, if you look at software, somewhere in there's a defect that somebody put in, inadvertently, obviously. Either they didn't understand what the software was supposed to do, or they didn't understand the requirement as it was written, or they made a mistake in the coding, or somebody didn't test that particular eventuality in the testing, and that defect has made its way into production. The number of inputs into that system is obviously large, it's varied, and at some point, that set of inputs is going to cause that software, that one little piece of software with a defect, to be executed, and it will execute incorrectly. So that's why I think of it as a landmine, and it's not my idea. I got it off a PhD thesis of a student in Nuclear Institute in India, of all places. And he had a lovely little diagram of all these X's and a path through either avoiding the X's or hitting it. And that's really the big point, is the fact that the software has operated so far reliably is not a guarantee that it won't fail in the future. It's like one of those financial prospectuses, right? You read that, the disclaimer, right? Past performance is no guarantee of future results.
Isn't there also this magical gray area where the timing of the demands of the software have to match up with the timing of the actual circuitry of the computer? That's another place where there can be failures of a software, so that even if the code theoretically looks like it's correct, there's an issue sometimes with the timing, isn't there?
Let's say there's two issues in timing. One is when you talk about real-time systems, these are systems that have to respond to an event within a certain time frame. Let's say, for your ABS brake, it's every 5 milliseconds, or the deadline is 1 or 2 milliseconds, or however. And there's a distinction there between soft real-time. Hey, we missed a deadline, but no big deal. The user didn't notice that his text message was 5 seconds late. Okay, so that's soft real-time. If that goes on too long, then the phone company starts losing money because they lose subscribers. Hard real-time means that something is going to be broken if that piece of software does not respond within its deadline. And that happens a lot, or that is a big consideration when you have multiple tasks, in other words, multiple independent or interlocked operations sharing the same processor. Right? The processor can only process one instruction at a time. So it processes the instruction from task A, and then the task A finishes, task B jumps on the processor, executes its tasks. And what happens if there's an urgent requirement? Well, task B gets taken off the processor, and the task that's supposed to manage the urgent event jumps in. And if that task doesn't get onto the processor or takes too long, then you have what's called a hard real-time failure. The other issue of timing is if you have two tasks that use a shared resource, and one of them, this would happen if you're sharing a file. This just to bring it back to something that people can relate to. You're sharing a file on a file server. Right? You're at work, and somebody says, "Hey, could you update that Excel file?" Yeah, sure. And you download it from the server, and you open it with Excel on your computer. And meanwhile, that person forgot that they asked you to update it. and they download it and update it on their machine, and write back the results. Well, which version of the file are we going to have on the server? And it's going to happen. It's going to be whoever wrote it last overwrote the previous one, right? So that's a very simplistic idea of a timing race. In other words, the result that you get depends on on arbitrary timing. One task finishes before the other, right? Or one person writes their file back to the server before the other. And that is a very, well, first of all, that's a very hard bug to discover. And the idea is to recognize those race conditions, right, in the design and avoid them. And there are ways, there are well-known ways of avoiding those. All that theory has been developed since the 60s.
What's not going to be in your presentation?
Security.
Your time is limited. You got to squeeze all the best stuff in there, and you'd think that because they're having these hearings license for an unusually long period of time, that's their little way of reducing the amount of hearings per year, if you were to graph it out that way, right? The hearings, I mean, originally there were 2 years, and then it was 5, now it's 10, and the less public hearings. You'd think you'd get more time.
That is a question that you should be putting to the commission secretary or the commission president. I'm not responsible for these people's actions. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. What's not going to be in your presentation because of the limits of time?
Most security. I want to talk about cyber security, but it's easier to talk about to focus on one thing, and I'm focusing on software safety. Now, everybody says, well, cybersecurity is a big thing, yes, but they're related concepts, but they are not the same. So you can have safe software. In other words, it will operate the anti-lock brake or the nuclear reactor or the Tesla car, whatever, but be insecure because somebody left a default password. It's ABC123. So that's I mean, totally simplistic example. Or you can have secure software that's full of holes and it's going to crash. Although that's
and what about the Stuxnet virus and other outside ways of interfering with the process of the plant? I mean, maybe not even the mission-critical computers, maybe different other levels of...
Well, Stuxnet, I believe, was centrifuges.
Oh, right.
It basically caused them to spin out of control.
But a cyber attack from an outside adversarial entity to disrupt the production at the plant. It's not an unbelievable scenario.
Yeah, I want to stay away from that whole thing because, first of all, you'd have to speculate on their state of readiness, and on their procedures. I mean, do they pat people down to make sure they're not walking in with a USB stick, or a Bluetooth-enabled device, or I don't know. For all I know, they're still using floppy disks. So I really don't want to speculate about cybersecurity because I want to focus on software safety, and that's something that they can't deny. Yeah. It's like, oh no, we have air gap security, we have these procedures in place, blah blah blah. Okay, that's great, but a lot of the instrumentation and control systems in a nuclear plant, just because software, it makes it so flexible that you can turn a general purpose piece of hardware into a specific purpose instrument. It's very tempting to use software, and these people, I shouldn't call them these people, I mean, that's disrespectful. Ontario engineers, and I'm a P.Eng, member of the Professional Engineers Ontario, seem to have a blind spot for software engineering. Saw that there was a few years ago, there was a whole article or whole issue of the PEO magazine, so Engineering Dimensions, devoted to safety, and there's not a word about software engineering in there. It was all cranes, trains, and planes, which kind of gives you an idea of the mentality that as long as the pump's working and the valves are operating correctly and the thermometer readings are correct, everything's fine. So there's a blind spot in that conventional engineering, if I may call it that, over the role of software in maintaining plant safety.
You really have an array of sensors that are measuring the state of things. Mm-hmm. Then there's how you connect those sensors to the computers. And then there's the age and condition of those computers. And then there's the quality and ability to update and maintain the software. So a lot of those things are hard to change once installed. Maybe you can change the sensors, but a lot of the time the cabling, which has been a problem at several U.S. nuclear power plants, is flooded or not waterproof or not upgraded or disconnected in an accident, etc. The computers, I've heard, are at the ones that we're talking about at Pickering, they're beyond antique. And then the software, which we may or may not be in control of ourselves, isn't it farmed out to another company in America? And what I really wanted to ask you is, we have some lessons learned, let's say, from Fukushima. Are we able to update the software, firmware upgrades? Or do we even have control over the software?
That's my question to CNSC and OPG is either, as you say, the equipment has aged and the conditions have changed such that now the path through that control software could hit one of those landmines, just because now we're executing a different sequence of instructions than when the plant was new and pristine. Or they've had to make those modifications to adapt to newer equipment. So they've updated the sensors. Maybe now you're digitizing instead of one way, to more accuracy or quicker. Or maybe you've introduced a network to carry the signals back and forth instead of individual wires, as you mentioned, that may be decaying or flooded or whatever. So you've had to upgrade the hardware, and which implies that you're upgrading the software. So my question then is, what is the process by which you ensure that the software changes are error-free? And kind of hard to hand wave in a podcast, but if you can picture a V, right? So the letter V, capital letter V, and at the top left of the V, you have sort of, from top to bottom, it goes from more general to more detailed. So very detailed at the bottom, very vague, and a high level at the top. Right. So we have, first of all, what's called a requirements capture. What is the software supposed to do? Then we go to specification, the high-level specifications. Well, how are we going to engineer the software to actually meet those requirements? And then you go into a more detailed specification. And then finally, you actually code, you write the actual program steps. So that's the left side of the V, going down from more general to more specific. Coming back up the right side of the V, right? You think of it as an arrow going from the top left to the bottom middle. And so you come back up the other branch of the V on the right side, and you go from the more specific. You're going to do a unit test. In other words, does each little component of that software do its job? And then you put these two components together into a successively larger and larger systems, and that's called integration testing. And then finally, you go to acceptance testing to see that what you've constructed actually meets the requirements of the actual device. over top, that's called the software, that's called the V model. It's well known in software engineering. And at each stage, as you go down more and more specific, you generate a test. Not only do you generate a specification coming out, but you also generate a test so that when you come back up the other side of the branch, the other side of the V, that you've tested your results against the detailed design, you've tested your integration testing against the requirements, you tested the acceptance testing against the original requirement capture. Over top of that, there's also parallel activities, right? We're not programming here. This is software engineering. It's a completely different, I mean, it's related obviously, but it's a methodology or a set of methodologies and processes and procedures to make sure that the software does the job. And obviously people who are, software engineers know how to code, but coding is just one part of it. So the parallel activity is hazard analysis. What if the software fails to open this valve? Okay, so we identify that as a hazard, or the reactor core is going to heat up, or the anti-lock brake is not going to be released, and a skid will be initiated. That's the hazards. And then for each of those hazards that's been identified, you come up with mitigation measures. So say, okay, well, we'll need some hardware interlocks in case the software doesn't open that valve. We'll have, let's say, a cheap bimetallic contact valve that'll snap open. It's probably a far-fetched example, but it works for automobile radiators, so
Yeah.
So the other one is a failure mode, FMEA, sorry about all the acronyms, failure mode effects analysis. So if the software at this point fails to open the valve, what is the consequence of that, right? What are the effects of the failure of that software? And for all I know, OPG is doing that, but I want to see evidence. Very ironic, there's a CSA specification, standard, not specification, N290.14 as one of the sets of standards published by the Canadian Standards Association to regulate nuclear operations, nuclear plant operations. And it's, as I read it out here, it's qualification of digital hardware and software for use in instrumentation and control applications for nuclear power plants. It's basically the set of procedures that OPG would go through to qualify an external vendor. Now, here's the irony. We, the public, don't know if OPG will actually qualify under the standard that they use to qualify people who sell them software. Right? We want transparency. OPG insists on transparency by their vendors. We want transparency from OPG.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the points I want to make.
Public oversight. If there's nothing for them to hide, then why can't we see?
And it's not like I'm asking them for their source code.
Right.
I'm asking them to lay out the procedures, the processes, the
criterion
of the of how they modify software or how they write new software. If they want to keep their secret sauce secret, that's fine. I want to know that secret sauce has actually been cooked correctly, if I may mix metaphors.
If they followed the recipe. So people can watch these hearings. There's a link. I used to use an old link. I had it written down somewhere. But I noticed the link is a little different this year. I'm wasting time here. I'm sure I had it written down. But there's a link, it'll obviously be in the show notes, but I think they've changed it to nuclearsafety.gc.ca.
Right. So, well, I guess there's two ways of getting to the CNSC site. One is CNSC CCSN.gc.ca, but CCSN is being the acronym for the French. But then they've also done a little bit of branding, and it's www.nuclearsafety.gc.ca.
Right.
GC, obviously, the Government of Canada.ca for Canada.
That's where it will be webcasted, apparently, is nuclearsafety.gc.ca.
You can download all the material that's been sent in. First of all, the written interventions, as well as any supplementary documents that have been submitted, including some responses already from OPG to some of the concerns. And that's, you can just download it as one big zip bundle, and it's a bunch of PDF files. PDF files are searchable if you want to look for keywords. There's about 35 intervenors who are presenting concerns about the continued operation.
That's a lot, isn't it?
Yes, that is a lot, and there's a few who are just residents of Pickering or residents of Toronto who plucked up their courage to go and speak to this big official hearing.
Could we conclude there's more public interest in these hearings than other hearings that have occurred?
Certainly, I would say so. Partly, there's been an all-out effort by some of the leading activist groups. So, Greenpeace, Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. Those organizations have Northwatch as well.
Durham Nuclear Awareness.
Yeah, Durham Nuclear Awareness. I should not forget them. Have done a stellar job of trying to get people interested in it and coach people who've never presented to any official body like that. I absolutely admire them for doing so. Some people are. Well, I remember the first time I presented to my local municipal council, and my knees were shaking. This is a big deal. I'm still, I'm over that, but I'm still very apprehensive when I'm presenting to an official body.
Well, this was a little block of questions I had for you that I had planned to ask you, and so they basically what they are is, when did you first become interested in nuclear? When did you first even hear of these hearings? When did you first go to these hearings? When did you first present at these hearings? You presented at a bunch of these hearings.
Yeah, yes, I have. Since, I think, 2011, whereas there was a joint panel between CIA, there was Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and CNSC over proposed new build at Darlington.
Right.
Wait, how did I get involved? I can't even remember. I think it's because I knew some people who were involved in Durham Nuclear Awareness, and met them through the Green Party. So I was helping with the campaigns. I guess 2007 is when I started getting interested in this kind of stuff. It was one of those things. It's like, well, I've got some free time on my hand. There's an election coming up. Wonder if the Greens need my help. I was bored looking for something to do. And my expertise has to do with software, which seems to be an expertise that's not very well, as I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of coverage in that nuclear industry. It's all chemistry, pumps and valves, heat transfer, thermodynamics, turbines, and so on, but not a whole lot of thought to software.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
I have a lot of respect for the fact that they're going to be making presentations saying, I don't think it's a good idea. It's too close to a large population center. It's over its lifespan. The plan to shut it down and not dismantle it immediately is irresponsible. I think that's pretty much all the... Oh, and there's no credible emergency response plan for a large-scale accident, something the size of Fukushima or Chernobyl. It's perfectly valid to say, I have concerns.
Yeah.
It's not... and I expect the Commission will be respectful of those people, unlike some politicians in Durham Region who would just shut down that kind of person with really stupid comments. At least the CNSC does try to be respectful of interveners who are doing it for the first time, or just out of the heartfelt concern that pursuing the Pickering for another 6 years of operation and then 4 years of gradual shutdown.
And why shouldn't they speak up? They're paying for all this stuff. And
well, exactly.
They don't need to know the part number of the valve. No. There are other ways and other arguments and other concerns. And then when you're paying for it, we're supposed to be a democracy, and they purposely keep this out of the election. So your only way you can exercise your duty is to go at least learn a little bit about this primary source of electricity in Ontario.
Exactly. Now, other interveners have a lot more technical expertise than I do. You'd have, and I'll give you the categories. It's people who are concerned about the effects of radiation releases. And when we're talking about radiation, well, there's two components of radiation. There's the radiation itself, but what causes radiation? Well, these are radioactive radionuclides, radioactive elements. So atoms that eventually disintegrate and produce energy, either alpha, beta, or gamma particles.
And that's just dust. I mean, for simple people.
It's also water molecules. Yeah. So one of the big concerns is tritium, which is basically radioactive hydrogen. And as we know, water is H2O, so two hydrogens for one oxygen in the molecule. We're however many percent, was it 80% water? That means that this water is radioactive and is trapped in our bodies. It's part of the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen organic chemistry of our body, and one of these tritium atoms disintegrates, it produces radiation. Well, big deal. In the one case, nothing happens. The other case, the cell dies. Well, big deal. Cells die all the time, right? Our body replenishes itself over the course of several weeks. What the third case that should be of a concern is that particle will cause a spontaneous mutation, which could eventually lead to cancer. And that is the overall concern about radiation.
So to summarize the tritium, so it's different when you've ingested it, and that particle is being released in direct contact with tissue. Another thing is that people will argue that tritium is a low-level radioactive energy event, but that actually feeds your argument about, well, you might not kill the cell then, you'll just mess up its DNA.
Correct.
So, yeah. And furthermore, there's sort of a sentence that I've always liked was that whatever the tritium concentration is in your environment is the tritium concentration you will have inside your body. So you're breathing it, you're drinking it, you're eating it, and because tritium is this ubiquitous friend of hydrogen, that's indistinguishable from hydrogen, your body can't tell the difference between friendly hydrogen and tritiated water.
Yeah. So that's it. So chemically, there's some minor differences I don't understand. I'm not a chemist, but essentially it behaves the same as hydrogen, and tritiated water behaves the same as far as chemistry is concerned as water. There are, right, somebody could jump in and say, "Did you know that?" Okay, well, that "Did you know that?" question is always intended as an argument killer.
Right.
But yeah, they could come in and say that, but to all intents and purposes, we've ingested it. But there's so that's one group of interveners, and they're concerned about releases of radiations and the environmental effects and health effects of radiation. There's another group of interveners who are concerned about the nuclear waste. I'm terrible with names, but I'll remember a quote. And the quote is, the nuclear waste is the real result of nuclear reactors, whereas the electricity is just a fleeting byproduct. And that's very true. The question is what are you going to do with these tons and tons of high-level irradiated fuel? In other words, it has radioactive decay product. It has some plutonium, which, if refined, could help produce nuclear weapons. So there's a proliferation issue, as we saw in the case of India. Another group of interveners is worried about the environment, and specifically how these nuclear plants are cooled is by pulling in water from Lake Ontario. You'll notice that most nuclear plants are by a large body of water. So Point Lepreau is at sea level. Gentilly was on the St. Lawrence River at Trois-Rivières. And Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering are on the Great Lakes. Otherwise, you need cooling towers, right, which are unsightly and would stigmatize a community, which is why OPG doesn't want cooling towers. But this enormous amount of water gets entrained into the plant to get cooled, to cool the process, and comes back to the lake a few degrees warmer. Well, a few degrees warmer, you might say, is not a big deal, but if that's enough to unbalance the ecology of that portion of the lake, you're disturbing the environment. There's some environmental effect. Not to mention that a lot of hatchlings and fry get entrained as well, and actually have a direct impact on the population of some species of fish in Lake Ontario. So that's another group, and there's a few groups. There's a few technically savvy interveners who will dispute OPG's claims that they're doing things safely, and then another group that will address directly the lack of emergency planning. So in the event of, I think, even a minor accident. I mean, the provincial nuclear emergency response plan was updated last year, I think about a year ago, and it really makes some assumptions that are optimistic at best. If you want to see what an evacuation looks like, I invite you to have a look. Well, when you come by the Pickering GO station, you'll walk over the 401 on that pedestrian overpass. Please do so at 4 o'clock on any afternoon.
Right.
And you know what? That evacuation is going to go nowhere.
Well, we saw a little in Katrina, but the recent hurricanes in Texas last year. What happens just in terms of the highways and controlling the flow outbound, and then people running out of gas, and then the guy who's supposed to be pumping the gas, well, he's got to evacuate his kids. Then coming the other way are these tanker trucks. Who's to keep those drivers from wanting to evacuate their families? Let's just say all the A's evacuate. And then we'll work to all everybody's last name starts with B, let's evacuate. I mean, can you imagine the logistics of that on the radio? Like, if you're a C, you're not going to evacuate? I mean, we're talking about something that I think everybody knows is just not possible.
you know what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of people heading for Peterborough and Lindsay and Parry Sound, and just get out of Dodge.
And how you would coordinate that. And then the whole idea of mitigation is prompt notification. The duty of the government would be to promptly notify, but as soon as you've notified, any idea of a coordinated evacuation becomes unmanageable.
Absolutely.
So then we've got shelter in place. So we're supposed to tape up all the windows and forget about the air intakes of our hot water tanks or our furnaces. If it's negative 26 outside, we're supposed to seal off our house. I think even the fire marshal pointed out that's actually not possible. You can't seal up a house and use it to shelter in place more than as long as it takes for your house to cool down to 0 degrees. We also need fresh air to breathe too. It's kind of
yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we saw that the emergency response around Fukushima was telling people to evacuate, but in some cases they were evacuated into areas that were hotter than where they started from.
Right.
Just because of the way the wind carried the radioactive particles, the radioactive dust.
A few things that I find difficult are, this best case scenario, the minimization of legitimate concerns. And when it's done by this promoter of nuclear, the CNSC is essentially housed in the ministry responsible for exporting uranium and producing it. All we ever really see in social media is the CNSC promoting itself and the industry, and at the worst case, giving slaps on the wrists with fines and rubber stamping these licenses. Who's there to protect us?
Those people who pluck up the courage to go and speak truth to power. That's your first line of defense. People who genuinely want to make an intervention and share their concerns with this body that really is their terms of reference is so narrow that they really can't tell. They couldn't come along and say to OPG, sorry, you have to shut this thing down. Their terms of reference would not be enough, and the next thing you know, the province of Ontario would be taking them to federal court or whatever the court is where you can appeal a government decision, and would be challenging the CNSC's decision in court. It would go that way if the CNSC decision came down against Pickering, and CNSC would be forced to justify that there's a weasel word in the legislation that gives the mandate to the CNSC, and the weasel word is a reasonable risk, and that is what you could argue, saying no, we've taken all the precautions to make sure that the risk is reasonable and make a good argument. So from my point of view, the CNSC cannot give a no decision. And by the way, that makes me respect those people who pluck up the courage to come and speak truth to power even more, because they know they're fighting a done deal, essentially. The decision's already been made.
The kinds of links that I'll be posting just without your input is, like I said, a PDF of the presenters, a PDF of the documents, the link to the webcast. Any other sources of reading people can do that you can give?
To inform themselves, well, there's a couple of good reports from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. They're well written.
Right.
And quite, they're written by respected researchers, but they're also written in a way to be accessible.
Right.
One has to do with radiation effects. The other one what will be the radiation effects of a Fukushima scale radiation release in the Pickering Scarborough area.
Wow.
And the other one is an argument it's about the economics of keeping Pickering open.
Right. Compared to importing electricity from Quebec, or not needing it, or increased efficiency, and all of the common sense arguments.
Yeah. The other one would be the Greenpeace International research paper on Fukushima. And, that clearly made the case that it was a man-made accident. It was not, yes, there was a big tsunami, but a lax regulator made it possible for the operator, TEPCO, to ignore security or safety recommendations. In other words, take those generators and put them above sea level, build up the seawall that would have protected it against the tsunami in the first place. Those safety improvements, upgrades, had been recommended years ago, and the regulator didn't insist on them.
To save money for TEPCO.
To save money for TEPCO for whatever, for whatever reason, it was judged unimportant and never done. So the diesel generators were in the basement. They were immediately flooded. The tsunami obviously breached the wall, and there was no. There was even a case where the plant manager disobeyed an order from head office to not use. So the order was, don't use seawater to cool the reactor. Yeah. He said, forget you. I need to cool down this reactor, and he started pumping in seawater, and that prevented an even worse meltdown.
And the reason why that's an interesting issue is because just like if you sort of put salt in water in a pot on the stove and you let it boil down, you see a residue on the inside of the pot. When you're constantly adding water that boils off, it doesn't take long for the salt to build up inside the reactor vessel or whatever tubes and stuff that you're cooling, because the water evaporates away, leaves the salt and contaminants. And this renders your multi-billion-dollar plant useless afterwards. And TEPCO didn't want to do that.
Yes, if that's the reason, that makes sense. Now, but the point is, it's a man-made accident, and so that Greenpeace International report makes for interesting reading. In the more academic space, there's a gentleman by the name of Charles Perrow, P-E-R-R-O-W, and about 20 years ago wrote a book called Normal Accident Theory. So it's a bit of a heavy read, but it's basically saying it's deceptively simple, to use the words of another researcher, is when you have billions of interactions, some of which can lead to an accident, then that 1,000,000 to 1 chance is bound to happen. And so he's saying that we should expect these meltdowns, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, to occur on a regular basis, because it's normal for very complex mechanical, software, electronic, chemical systems, but also socio-political, right? Because we have political in the mix. We have a social side. We talked about that nuclear culture where the people in the nuclear industry reinforce each other. Mm-hmm. So in a highly complex system like that, you're bound to have accidents. So that's it's called normal accident theory. It's probably a little bit of a heavy read, But I'm sure the introduction, it should be available through your library either. I know it's available in the UIT library, so anybody could walk into that library and read the book on site. You might not be able to borrow it if you're not a student or staff.
So the question isn't if, it's a real question of when or where.
When and where, exactly. These things happen every dozen years or so. And as the reactors age, we can expect more. As new reactors are built with greater and greater cost overruns. If we have a look at what's happening with Areva, the French company that is kind of Tweedledum and Tweedledee with Électricité de France, which is the French state-owned electric utility. Mm-hmm. They've tried to build a new reactor in France, as well as one in Finland, and these things are years behind schedule and billions of euros, not just dollars.
Is that the European pressurized reactor?
Yes, yes, the new EPRs.
And Areva needs to be bailed out by the French government every few years by the 10 billion, no?
Oh, absolutely.
And just it's a mirror of Westinghouse and its AP 1000, and mm-hmm. the bankruptcy of Westinghouse and its requirement for bailouts. It's just bailout, yeah.
And all the money that went into the advanced CANDU reactor that eventually. In this case, it wasn't a bailout; it was a fire sale of AECL to SMC leveling.
Right, for $15 million. So yes, public funds went into AECL from the 40s.
Yes.
And they sold it to SNC Lavalin for $15 million.
Exactly. So, when you were talking about subsidies, oh my goodness. But anyway, so I'll gather up some material. I've got it sort of here and there, but just read through the interventions.
Right.
You just download the whole zip file as one, unpack it, and what I did is I sat in the lawn chair in the shade of a nice tree, put it on on my tablet, and just went through one at a time.
Wow.
And some of them you can just read, like the municipalities. It's like, oh, we're great corporate citizens. Okay, flip. But there's a few that are very technical and frankly quite scary.
Here's an opportunity to exceed your 10-minute limit.
To exceed my 10. Well, the tactically, it's you've got 10 minutes, but the idea is you have 10 minutes to make an impression to get the commissioners to ask questions. And then what the commissioners will ask questions of myself, they'll ask questions of CNSC staff and of OPG, and that generates a nice little round-robin conversation.
So procedurally, it's a little different at these hearings. You ask a question, and then if you're polite enough, see, because I give a presentation, and they're so angry at me by the end of the presentation, that's it. Our next guest.
Yeah. No, I try to keep the subject neutral, and I'm not going to say it outright, but the point of view I'm taking is that I could be pro-nuclear and still asking them to do it right.
Sure.
But the idea is to get that conversation going and suggest questions that the CNSC might want to ask of either, like the commissioners would ask of the staff or OPG. And I mean, this would be the bonanza, is that they add a licensing condition to, let's say, force transparency of their software development process.
You're asking questions that we're never going to hear in the news. there's no one else asking these questions, and there's no information brochure on their website, addressing a lot of these difficult questions. This is our only forum for this.
Exactly. So that's why I don't want to waste the opportunity by getting the chairman angry at me and kicking me out.
Right. Do you think that things will be different with Velshi in control of this CNSC commission?
Well, obviously be different because she's different from President Binder. There's a ray of hope, and the ray of hope is at the Darlington relicensing a few years ago. Intervenor after intervenor after intervenor kept hammering on the point that the provincial nuclear emergency response plan hadn't been updated for 15 years. And finally, she just sort of kind of went, well, wait a second. We've heard this over and over and over again, and made a point of getting the province to update the nuclear emergency response plan. So that was her.
Yeah. Prompted by multiple presentations, but that she finally...
Yes, exactly. So that's the ray of hope. However, she is an industry insider. She was on the board of OPG, and I believe her son was was fairly close to the Harper Prime Minister's office.
And that's Ali Velshi, who's a presenter now on MSNBC.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
That's his mom.
Yeah, small world. So yes, I mean, there were many attempts in the past to get her to recuse herself as a commission member because of the parent's conflict of interest. There's nothing we can do about that. That was the minister's appointment, probably blessed by the Prime Minister, and end of that story. So I don't really want to speculate more, but hopefully she does approach it with a little bit more of an open mind than the incumbent.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
And I'm Louis Bertrand in Blackstock, Ontario.